Thank you for joining us. We've got a few technical problems today, and one of our panelists might only be able to talk to us by voice, but we'll see how we get on in the course of today's discussion. Welcome from me, Michael Scott in London, and from my joint convener, Sanford J. Ungar in Washington, to the 51st jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, and freedoms in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. And in a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who is the director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished guests and moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the question and answer session. From the start, you can type in questions to the panel by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A button, not the chat button. These questions will come to me during the session, and I will try and put them into some kind of order for the panel to consider later on when I will appear again on screen. We urge you to ask the questions as and when they occur to you so that we don't get a bottleneck at the end. Right, over to you, Sandy.
Thank you, Mike. And if the statute of limitations has not expired yet, Happy New Year to everyone associated with this program. We appreciate your participation. We're now in our 5th year, and we're very proud of the great diversity, which we will continue to uphold and be proud of in our presentation of topics and participants and the way we proceed. I do want to note that Dr. Nora Volkov, the rather well-regarded director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse at the National Institutes of Mental Health here in Washington, withdrew at the last moment this morning from this program without explanation. And we're sorry she isn't with us, but we do have 3 other wonderful panelists who are kind enough, even though we can't see one of them right now. We're very glad to have all 3 of them with us. Let me introduce Pippa Hockton, who trained in psychotherapy at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. She practiced as a psychotherapist before founding a charity called Street Talk in 2005. And with 12 colleagues, she does remarkable work taking psychotherapy to women in the street and dealing with mental health issues right there on the firing line. And I hold her in tremendous admiration for what she does. Along with her in the UK is Mario Kraft, who's having trouble with his brand new computer. We know he's there, we just can't see him. He is the founder of a care organization called Pending Park, which runs 8 care homes and an in-house training academy in North Wales. He was awarded an MBE in 2010 for his services to social care and has received the Welsh Government's St. David Award for Enterprise. Here in the United States, in Southern California, happily safe from the fires that had recently been such a plague, is Karen D. Lincoln. She directs the Center for Environmental Health Disparities Research in the Program in Public Health at the University of California, Irvine. And she's a social worker and sociologist with expertise in the social determinants of health disparities. Clearly very important and an issue that's very much with us. She conducts research on how to improve health outcomes for Black Americans, older adults, and other minoritized persons by investigating the psychosocial, behavioral, and biological mechanisms that help determine their health and well-being. Pippa, I'm going to go to you first. Well, it's still morning for us here. It's not morning for you in London, but I want to know what you think the prospects are, given recent political, social, complicated developments in the world, and including in Western democracies, and what you think the impact of all this on mental health might be.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the very generous introduction, Sandy. I think for all of us in the mental health community, most of us at any rate, we are very concerned indeed for the impact on mental health of recent developments in many parts of the world, not least close to home for you. I founded Street Talk just over 20 years ago, and the conditions for people on the street in London, marginalised people, have very much worsened. And sadly, I'd say the numbers are tenfold. We work only with women and women on the street. So our focus group is women selling sex, women in street prostitution, as we call it in the UK. But other women, women with no illegal migrants, women with no recourse to public funds, no entitlement to benefits. And life has got very, very much worse for those people. Just to give you an example of how life has got worse through global event, mainly the sort of mass displacement of people. Now, when somebody is awarded asylum in the UK, which is getting increasingly difficult, they have a very short period, 7 days, to leave their asylum seeker accommodation and find their own accommodation. And that route is to report to their local area housing office. And the advice they are receiving, and this includes people with families, young children, is to take themselves to one of the main stations and sleep there. So if you go to our main stations in London now, after trains, most of them are finished after midnight, they're absolutely carpeted with people, mainly families. And that was not the case when I started. So I'm gravely concerned at the worsening impact especially on vulnerable people of recent political developments in my own country, in your country, in many parts of the world, Israel, what we're seeing over there in Israel and Palestine. And yeah, so I'm sorry not to be more optimistic, but I have to be honest with you.
Karen Lincoln, my understanding is that your focus is much more on the policies and the circumstances that result in what Pippa sees in the streets, although in a different country. And I wonder if you feel it's fair to compare what you're hearing from her to what we're seeing here in the United States right now.
Sure. Well, thank you. And again, thank you for the introduction. And just one thing I'd like to add is that we're very proud that we have transitioned from a program in public health to a named school. We are now the Josie Wynn School of Population and Public Health at UC Irvine. And I'm a professor there, and I'm very proud to be
for you.
So yeah, I think I focus on minoritized populations, primarily Black Americans and older adults. And it's really interesting from our perspective in that, we are in the United States, but when you focus on specific populations, it's very different. It's almost like we're in a different country. And so when focusing on Black Americans, for example, I think what we're seeing around the world and what we're seeing in the United States is that we are talking about groups of people, populations that have been made vulnerable. by a host of political, economic, and social factors and environmental factors, who have already sort of suffered from not having access to mental health treatment and care, being misdiagnosed, being overdiagnosed, underdiagnosed, overtreated, undertreated, right? And just having a workforce that's not prepared to care for our populations. And so I think much like, street people and people who are receiving services on the street, it's very challenging. And I think, speaking of the wildfires, we now have, hundreds and hundreds of unhoused, quote unquote, people, right? And as you know, Los Angeles has one of the highest populations of unhoused people in the country. When our numbers go up, they go up for the entire country. And so we now are combating with a host of issues, the least of which is we already have, large populations of people without homes who suffer from a host of mental health issues and are having very difficult time getting treatment. And now we have people who are suffering these devastating, tragedies, who may also suffer, right, from a host of psychological distress and mental health factors that are even exacerbated by being unhoused, and the political and economic issues that go along with that, as well as children, right? I focus on older adults and adults, but when you think about children who've lost their homes, their schools, their communities, and you think about as they age and the implications of that, it's quite troubling. And so even without considering the global context, which is quite devastating, within the local context, we're also seeing issues that were previously unaddressed that are now exacerbated by more recent conditions.
We all know that childhood trauma often results in very severe mental illness later in life. So I certainly understand what you're talking about. Mario, if it's not too difficult, your camera will talk for you, or you will talk through your
yeah. Can you hear me?
on our
Okay.
screen. Yes, we hear you. We hear you
You
fine.
hear you? Okay.
And
well,
what I'd like you to address initially is whether there's a palpable change in the care homes and the organizations that you're involved with of recent developments, whether you perceive the mental health circumstances of people in your constituencies as getting worse, or are people
yeah.
coping
Okay.
better?
Yeah. Well, I certainly give you a go at that, and I'm very sorry to people for my technical issues here in Wales are a bit of an issue, but there we are. Now, with regard to a little bit of context, I as it said, I work in Care for in Wales, and we link very much with the UK-based care organisations, Scotland, England, and Northern Ireland, and also our colleagues in the Republic of Ireland. So we have quite a good understanding of that. To a lesser degree, certain parts of Europe, France and Luxembourg, I know a little about. But I think the answer to the question is, is the mental health of older people who need care, is there any discernible change, I guess, in the last 10 or 20 years? And I think the answer has to be yes, and I think it's twofold. One, I think the numbers of people, particularly which are, I guess, drug-related, alcohol-related, and also for whatever reason, are predisposed to a form of dementia, Alzheimer's or whatever. We are seeing the numbers rise in those countries exponentially. So I don't think it's a UK phenomenon. I think it's also something you can look at, if you like, certainly Western Europe. I can't say that I can speak with any authority whatsoever outside of that. But what it does appear, and it was something that was said earlier by Pippa around, the political consequences, socioeconomic factors, the environment, how we live our lives, the change that's occurring. I think I was talking to an older person who we care for only last week, and what came across very strongly is how they struggle with the change, which is almost daily, weekly. You know, I think things change came about more slowly in days gone by. And I think to broaden it away from, if you like, dementia and care homes, we're seeing a lot of people who are younger in these countries, in the UK particularly, coming through on mental health services. And I'd extend that even to issues around technology and how that seems to be affecting children. I was reading something only this week about attention deficit disorder and how that seems to be growing exponentially. Now, I have no evidence on why that is, whether it's you know, the emojis or whatever on people's phones and so forth. But I do know a lot of schools now are banning phones. But you just wonder. I am an eternal optimist, but you know, just again to go back to what Pippa said, it's really hard to see where this is all going. And I guess, you know, we've all got to try and promote, I guess, healthy lifestyles. You know, living in families, doing things that are kind of maybe more simple. Because if we don't, on this sort of meteoric change that we're seeing, you wonder how that's going to be. But to answer your point, there's no doubt that we're seeing more and more people presenting with mental health issues for whatever reason. And I think drugs and alcohol has got a lot to do with it. But we're also seeing, as we've got an aging population, services really buckling, be they in the community or indeed in care homes. So I hope that gives you a bit of an answer to your question.
Right. You know, Mike Scott and I, who've been doing this series together, this is our 51st consecutive month since the depths of the pandemic that we've been doing these things. And I think we perceived ourselves as taking a break from politics this month because we've all been so swamped in politics. And I think it's almost impossible to take a break from politics, even on this subject, which should not be a political topic. But the news yesterday that President Trump is going to attempt to take the United States out of the World Health Organization. Turns out it's not so easy as it is to get out of the Paris Climate Accords, but he's going to try. And so I can't help bringing up that political point because it makes me wonder, will international sharing of information, will the goal of some creditable international cooperation on mental health issues be more elusive if the United States is withdrawing and not paying so much attention? Karen, I wonder if you have any thoughts about the immediate impact of that.
Yeah, I do. And I agree, Sandy, that it's hard to avoid politics. And I will tell you, one of the classes that I teach, it's called Health Status and Care Disparities. I inherited it when I moved from University of Southern California to UC Irvine. And I require The Political Determinants of Health as a textbook by Daniel Dawes. And again, we're talking about health status and care disparities, but you cannot ignore the determinants of the determinants, right? And that's what I teach my students in public health. We focus on social determinants of health, but those are determined by political determinants, right? So it's very difficult to escape talking about politics because it drives everything. And so, yes, I'm concerned about the information flow from the World Health Organization if there's disruption in our interaction with them. I have to say, as a health disparities researcher, you know, I'm very much connected to the information that comes from the World Health Organization because it drives policy. It's one thing to talk about what's happening in the United States or the UK or any other country, but when you talk about the World Health Organization, when they say this is true, this is what's happening at the on a global scale, it's very important, particularly as I highlight populations that are made vulnerable by a host of conditions, right? So, for example, as Maria was talking about Alzheimer's disease and dementia, that's one of my areas of expertise, brain health, right? That's a global issue. It happens to be much more prevalent among Black populations in the United States, right? But it's also a global issue. Social isolation and loneliness, is a global issue. It has also been identified as a public health crisis by our Surgeon General, right? And so I think, it's almost like, when the World Health Organization identifies these issues, we start to look at them, right? We can either relate to them or we are sort of alerted that these are issues that we need to be prepared to address if we're not already addressing them. And so I'm very concerned about, the conversations around, pulling out of the World Health Organization. But again, I agree with you. It's going to be very difficult. It's going to be very difficult to suspend or censor information that's sort of generated in a global context to the United States. And so that I'm happy about. I think because of social media and other relationships that we have globally, I'm hoping that that would be a disruptor with respect to the information flow around the world.
Pippa, you have people I imagine, from many different countries under your care over a period of time. And you've been doing this now for 20 years, right? So your insights, I'm sure, are deep and complex. But when you pause and think about this, not necessarily as a problem on the streets of London or in certain neighborhoods, but a problem for the world, what's your prescription? If you could tell leaders what they need to do, what we all need to do in order to improve mental health globally, what would that be?
If I had one wish, it would be that the focus shifted from treatments and interventions to causes and prevention on a global level. So building walls, refusing asylum, which is happening in the UK, and I'm not referring to what's happening in your country. There's a move in Europe to, batten down the hatches, pull up the drawbridges. And it's not recognizing that is no solution to the mass displacement of so many millions of people. I've lost track of the figure now of how many people are displaced, but that will only be fixed with a global initiative. That cannot be fixed in your corner on your patch. That does take the world, organizations like the United Nations and the World Health Authority to come together. And so that what I would wish is there was a real will across the globe to work together to address that. Because, we get news every day of how many people have drowned in the Channel today in little boats, and it's babies and it's mothers with babies trying to get to England, trying to get to our shores just to be safe. But it can't be fixed on our shores. It can only be fixed when you look at the causes, what's driving so much displacement. So I think my one wish would be stop looking at mental health from how you treat it, but look at it from how you prevent it. Because as you said, I think I trained 40 years ago, and I think the big shift in that 40 years has been, as you said, Sandy, we do have much more awareness of the impact of trauma and how a lot of mental illness is driven by trauma. We have much more understanding of that than we did 40 years ago, but we're not doing anything to prevent the trauma, and so it doesn't compute, it doesn't add up, and we're wasting resources on treating it when we could be spending those resources on preventing it. But that is only a global effort. It's not going to work country by country.
Are there any individuals or categories of people whom you think we can turn to now to try to rally the international community to understand how severe and how urgent these international mental health problems are?
Well, I think it seems to be going the other way, Sandy, that the global voices seem to be losing power or having their power stripped away from them. So there are international initiatives, but whether they're taken any notice of, whether it trickles down, there's pockets of great practice. The Scandinavian countries have had a long record of really good mental health, but they have a great social system, fantastic social housing, the children in the state care system. Just to give you an example, Denmark, 89% of children who have grown up in the state care system go on to university in Denmark. In England, 6% of children in the state care system go on to university. And it's because we don't have a great state care system here. So we've long known that those countries that have a good state access to nature, good access to healthcare, education, we look after vulnerable children, vulnerable families, where that's invested in, have fantastic outcomes for mental health. But we don't want it because it brings high taxation. And in our country, we want mental health on the cheap. We want a quick fix that's cheap, and it doesn't work like that. So I just see it, sadly, I just see it go. I agree, we do need powerful, collective, global voices, and we need to learn from those countries that are getting this right. And it frustrates me that Denmark is not that far from England. It's hundreds of miles, not thousands. And they have great mental health and look after vulnerable people really well, but it doesn't come across the North Sea to us. We take no notice of that good example.
Mario, as a practitioner of your particular category, bringing people in, trying to take care of them or help their families take care of them in a responsible way, what changes would you appeal to the international community to think about making?
Well, I think it's very difficult when you compare. It's a very good point about Denmark and Scandinavia, and that's absolutely correct. I think we can learn a lot, but I think we've almost got to take a step back, and people, and I guess this is going to rest with younger people, they've got to have some encouragement or be, almost like nutrition towards careness, to be caring. I think this is one of the biggest problems that we face, and it plays right through. I mean, I don't know, scientifically there's all sorts of things that we read about, and dementia can be slowed down or even cured in how many years' time, but we've got a global population that is becoming increasingly unwell. It's becoming aged. And I think we've almost got to look at it really from the other angle. If we're going to really talk about how do you change things, it's as big an issue, surely, as the environment is. And what I would say, if we keep going on doing the same things, well, it would be absurd to expect we're not going to have the same result. Because it seems to me, and you see it with people from poorer countries wanting to go to, industrialized countries, and you completely understand that, for prosperity and obviously often to get away from conflict. But what is actually driving us, as a species almost? Do we drive for ever more money, ever more status, or whatever? And is there not something we can learn from previous times, and maybe from other countries, possibly not so developed countries, where people can just be happier? I don't know, maybe somebody on the call would understand far better than I, but you know, when you look at smaller countries in population like Bhutan in the east, you know, I mean, they do have a happiness survey there. Now, I don't know about all the challenges of living in Bhutan, or people tell me it's a wonderful place to visit, but is there something that we're missing as a sort of a Western civilization, ever wanting more, you know, and that whole kind of drive for that type of prosperity? Is it leaving something behind which actually makes us feel less content, which affects our well-being and then contributes to our mental health? I mean, it's tragic, really. I mean, I was in London recently, and picking up on Pippa's point, you know, seeing, you know, some of the what you call the most exclusive streets in London, and you see these people, you know, and they're displaced, and they're clearly, you know, in a terrible state, living in cardboard and all of this, and you couldn't believe that. I mean, my grandmother used to live in London. I can't imagine that was the case, you know. I mean, I'm sure there were lots of poorer areas in London, but these seem to be people from other countries, and it really is a great concern of how we deal with it. It's a massive problem, and I think what we've got to do as a global community is keep talking about it. But I have to say, politically, it's not got the ascendancy that it deserves, and until it does, we might struggle to have the change that we need.
All right, thank you. I just want to interrupt the flow for a moment to say that for people who are participating from afar by Zoom, now would be a good time to put any questions or comments that you have into the Q&A section, so that Mike Scott can take those points up with the panelists in just a few more minutes. So if you have questions or comments that you want to put in, now's a good time. Karen, I wanted to ask you, I want to direct your attention to something that I'll bet you've thought about, which is, and Mario just referred to it, that maybe in countries or communities with a different kind of structure, with less bureaucracy and more humanity driving the organization, that maybe sometimes it's simpler to see the way through some of these problems. And when I say simpler, I don't mean to dismiss the complexity of any of this. But I wonder, not only other countries, but minority communities, isolated communities that have had to deal with things themselves, what you've observed and concluded there.
Yeah, I agree. I agree, you know, with Mario to the extent that there are cultural differences and there's culture, right? And I can speak within the context of the United States that, you know, we are living in a capitalist society with a very strong ideology that is often counter to other cultures. And for those of us here and around the world who have maintained a culture of communalism and community, and not taken on this sort of independent identity, and we have a collective kind of culture, that is a little bit different in that, you know, they're much more tight-knit and reliant upon each other, not so distracted by some of the factors that are sort of driving our culture in the United States with respect to the ideology of social mobility, and sort of look at these shiny things and don't worry about these things. And I think part of what I think is important is for us to look at the examples of people who are living well. And I agree with Pippa in that there are countries and communities around the world who are aging well, who are taking care of their citizens from the time they're born until the time they die. The United States spends more money on healthcare than any other developed nation combined. And we have the worst outcomes than any other developed nation combined. There's something wrong with that, right? And so I think we do know what works well. And Pippa, I absolutely agree that we have plenty of examples of prevention. We understand what the causes are, but we lack the political will. I don't think we need more data. I'm a social scientist. I collect data all the time. We don't need new data to tell us what we already know, that we know how to live well, we know how to take care of people, we know what works, we know what the causes are, we know what the solutions are. They're right there, but oftentimes they're in these small communities, they're in these small countries, they're within cultures that aren't sort of, assimilated, right, to the ideology of a particular country. And so I think the answers are there, and that's why I do the work that I do, because the answers are right there in our communities, but they're not highlighted, they're not disseminated, they're not well known, and they're not respected oftentimes. And so I honestly believe that we know how to solve these issues. We just need the will to do it.
So Pippa, how do we sell some of these, not to be crass about it, but how do we sell some of these solutions that I think Karen identifies as being there and not so obscure? How do we make that jump?
We have an information challenge because, as Karen and Mario said, we know what to do. We do know how to fix this. But I think we're losing the information war, if you like. And I think we're kind of the sort of the distraction of wanting more, and all those things, the sort of capitalistic values are winning. And I would say, I can't speak for your country, I can't speak for the United States or other countries, but I would say in the UK, a lot of that lies with we have a very right-wing press for the most part, who are very powerful, a right-wing media who, have a message that is against a sort of creating a more even society. I mean, that's what the model is in Scandinavia. The gap between rich and poor is much less, and the rich are not so rich and the poor are not so poor, and everybody is roughly okay. And that's what we aspire to. But I think those who stand to lose, in their heads stand to lose by that, are winning the information war. That is the trouble. And sadly, all the research shows that in countries where the gap between rich and poor is less extreme, it's more moderate, those at the higher end are happier. They are even happier than the people at the poor end. So everybody wins when the gap between rich and poor is less. But I think the people, big business is winning. And the big business, including the media, that they are winning, and we're a small, still voice. And I am baffled to know how to be heard against all that noise that has a different message, the opposite message, I'm afraid. So I don't have a good answer for you, Sandy, I'm afraid. I think I know who the enemy is, but I don't know how to fight them. I feel like David and Goliath, but I haven't got a sling to. I'm disarmed.
I see a sign behind you that says "Good vibes only."
Yeah, that's my daughter's.
I'm sorry?
That's my daughter's, yeah.
Has she had an influence on you?
Oh yes. She's a very uplifting little person. Yes. Yeah.
Well, it would be a good rule, good vibes only, if we could find if we could find some support for it and some.
Yeah.
I think in the work that you're doing, you must need some periodic evidence of progress, of accomplishment, of solving the very concrete problems of somebody every week, or some sort of measure like that, and then try to extrapolate beyond that to a nationwide and a global progress.
Yes. I mean, I think every single woman we work with raises your spirits because they have survived. You know, so that is, they survived, they want to live another day. And so the work is constantly uplifting in that respect. But I wish the women who have, that we only work with women, that's why I keep referring to women. I wish I could amplify their voice about how they have survived. You know, I work with women who've seen their whole family chopped to pieces in front of them in some conflict zones in the world, and they still want to live, and they still have hope and optimism. And how do we amplify that voice? I would love to amplify not my voice, but the voice of the women we work with. They should be our leaders, not the leaders we have.
Right. And in a moment, we're going to go back to Mike Scott for discussion of any comments and questions that have come in. But Mario, before we do that, how do you relate to Pippa's problems and to Karen's description of some of these frustrations? What can you do from in your role to change things?
Okay, well, what I would say, going back, I mentioned the environment before. It's come up a couple of times. I mean, one of the great national treasures in the UK is a gentleman I'm sure you've all heard of called David Attenborough. And David Attenborough is a guy who is eternally optimistic. And I think by constantly raising issues, the important issues of the day, in his case, it's all obviously about the environment and the natural world. But I mean, we are part of that natural world. And indeed, our mental health, or good or bad, is related to that world that we inhabit. And I guess, as I touched on earlier, it's trying to be as optimistic as we can to try and understand the data we have. I couldn't agree more than with Karen about we don't need any more, really. We've got enough data. One of the great problems we have in Wales is they keep wanting to do a pilot project about something. And of course, it tells you what you already know. And I think we know enough about a lot of these issues, but it really needs people to want to change them. And that will be, I guess, above all, from trying to ensure that, you know, the present and future generations take on these challenges and this understanding. So I guess it's enlightenment almost, isn't it, about what will make a difference. And in a very small way, you know, in our very small organization, you know, we try to, we have a saying called the little things. It's something apparently that our patron saints, Saint David, was supposed to have said many, many years ago. And it is the little things that matter, and taken together, they become big things, don't they? And I guess that's the sort of thing you can't, you know, with Pippa again, you know, we can't change the world overnight. We can only do what's in our power, but we need to have that voice. And the more people are optimistic and the more people understand the issues and accept more about life and not always want more all the time, and not, you know, I mean, the conflicts in the world are just an example of the perilous state that we're all in. I mean, we are all in a terrible state, really, but somehow we've got to have the optimism of David Attenborough and others that it will get better, but we've just got to keep working at it. And those people that care enough, hopefully, will see us through this as a global population, and even as a species, ultimately.
Mike Scott, I want to welcome you back to the center of this discussion now and see if you have some comments that have accumulated there or some other approaches you'd like to take to this issue.
Yes, thanks. It's again, it's a very sobering discussion that's going on, and I think that's being reflected also by what people are saying. We've got somebody who wishes to remain anonymous saying, "Thank you for holding this panel. You all have pointed at the global displacement of persons that causes trauma on a mass scale. What role does our global climate change have in this displacement? Is our global mental health crisis also our climate crisis?" Karen, do you want to have a go at that?
Sure, yes. Well, climate change and mental health are connected. They have to be. And I think, that's one of the things that I want to develop in the work that I'm doing at the center, is that we don't have enough of a focus on the relationship between climate change and mental health. And I would like to say I am optimistic. I'm optimistic because I'm in communities working with older adults, particularly Black older adults who lived through segregation, who couldn't work in certain places, couldn't live in certain places. The tragedy we're seeing in Altadena with the fires, these are historically Black communities because they were only allowed to buy homes there because of redlining, right? And so generations of people are suffering as a result of these wildfires, but there's hope. And I find hope in the little things that I see in communities every day. And I have the honor of being in classrooms with students who are amazing. We are in good hands. We are in good hands. And I'm so blessed to interact with these students who are extremely diverse, coming from across the United States and other countries, who are committed to social justice, who are concerned about the environment. They understand disparities and they have ideas about how to fix it. And I am very, very hopeful that we can deal with this climate crisis. I want us to change our conversation to understand that mental health is physical health. We need to talk about them together. They are not to be disentangled. They are connected. If you have a physical health problem, you likely have a mental health problem. If you have a mental health problem, you likely have a physical health problem, but they're so bifurcated in terms of how we talk about them and how we treat them. And so I think with climate change, I think that might be the one of the crises like the pandemic that brings us together. It's unfortunate, but we're all affected, not equally, but we all are impacted by the climate crisis. And I hope that we can start to have conversations that highlight that across communities, because many of us are more affected by climate change than others, but we're all affected. And so I do hope, much like the crises that we've suffered over the world, that this is one that will bring us together.
Thanks for that. But the issue is that we're saying that, but there are people who are in denial of it. And the people who are in denial of it seem to have a lot of power, do they not? Pippa?
Yes, I agree. And I think that's the big challenge that we're facing at present, that we haven't chosen good leaders across the world, not pointing at any one particular leader, but across the world, we seem to have poor leaders, poor leadership. But I definitely agree with Karen that I think so long as we survive, the young people will fix this for us, because I do feel a different moral. I think they have not lost their moral compass. They have found their moral compass all by themselves, the young people, and I think they will save us. I do believe that. I think the question is, will we survive long enough for the young people? I do, maybe we should stop voting at a certain age now, have a cut-off age, and only young people can vote.
It does look, though, doesn't it, that somehow the way in which we are electing our governments might be putting these people in place who are the deniers, and therefore there's something fundamentally wrong. I've just recently read Rory Stewart's book on who was a member of Parliament in the UK, on politics on the edge. It demonstrates vividly from his own experience how little democracy is working, in the sense that it's only those who are actually at the top in government that are making in the UK that are making the decisions. The rest just have to vote as their parties tell them to, as W.S. Gilbert said so many years ago, and it hasn't changed really, has it? I don't know what you think about this, Mario. Do you? Have you got
Well,
a concept of it from Wales, which might be a bit more
well,
interesting?
all I would say is that I certainly agree with the comments about the stand of our political leaders across the world, whether they're despots, tyrants, criminals. It's absolutely dire, to be perfectly candid. And I guess what I would say is, and you look at Wales, I mean, we had devolution 25 years ago. So many of the things, education, as Mike knows very well, education, health, social services, local government, those sorts of things were devolved, and under an unusual formula, which is nobody understands anyway. Amounts of money were devolved from London. Well, of course, what have we seen since? Very little change, to be honest. You'd hope that a small country with 3.2 million population would be fleet of foot, would be able to adopt maybe some of those Scandinavian ideas, maybe, could look at the economy in a different way. What have we got? Well, a health service scores very badly against England, even though it's got more funding. I'm sorry to say our education isn't where it needs to be at any level. So you wonder how that has come about, because you've got the democracy. That's the point I'm trying to make, is you've got the freedom to vote for people that are more local, that are more in tune with your culture, even your language in Wales. But we don't seem to have the people with the vision. And I think it's a world that lacks leadership. I think that was touched on before. I think that is democracy is all very well if it works for everybody, but you've got to have somebody that really does lead for everybody. And of course, in the UK, I'm not going to comment on America. I think you've got enough issues of your own there. But certainly in the UK, the whole system of ministers is based on, doing what the Prime Minister said, because you want the next leg up the ladder. If you're the Home Secretary, you want to get the plum job, which is probably the Chancellor or the Foreign Secretary, and so it goes on. And it's all rather depressing, I have to say. I do agree with Karen, I think, and Pippa. I think we will work through it. I think the species will survive long enough to enable us to evolve into other ways, and hopefully more happy, more well areas, and our mental health and our general health and well-being can be improved right across the globe. But until that happens, I'm very pessimistic about our political class, who don't seem to listen. And if they care, they certainly don't care enough.
Thanks very much for that, Mario. I got a note here from Hannah Hubar, which is kind of makes your eyes open a bit. I recently lost my own house in a wildfire, actually. I started, and then Hannah goes on, I started a disaster relief organisation over a decade ago, and we focus on children, elderly and pets. They are often forgotten, and we continue to help throughout the process. That means from the start until whenever they feel okay. We're still helping some people from 2013. We have a tool called Hopeline, and we have people they can talk to at any time virtually. One of the things we do is research, and a project we are now doing with UNLV is the connection of human trafficking with disasters. Sorry, I just lost the quote. Something just came in and it's taken my quote away from me. Yeah, sorry about this. Is the connection of human trafficking and disasters. I would be interested to see numbers on the numbers of those who were affected by human trafficking in disasters, and how many were trying to find mental health resources. Have you got anything on that, Pippa? On mental health and disasters?
Well, we know that people are only trafficked when they are vulnerable. So traffickers know how to prey on vulnerability of all sorts. So people who don't have family to look after them, or who are fleeing from something. So obviously a disaster makes people vulnerable. So there will be a link. There will be victims of natural disasters or of conflict who become vulnerable to traffickers, for sure. Numbers on people trafficked are everybody's best guess, because we only know about the ones who escape. We can only count them. So people ask me all the time, how many victims of human trafficking are there in the UK? And we don't know, because we only know about the ones who escape from traffickers. And the thing that keeps me awake at night really is, for every woman we work who has escaped from traffickers, she will say, oh, I was kept in a brothel, there were 12 other girls there. And you think, where are, how can we help them? How can we get them? You're out, but there are 11 others, and no doubt somebody to replace you. So I'm going to say definitely there is a causal link between natural disasters and conflict, that there will be victims of trafficking from that. But the numbers are very sketchy, and they're everybody's best guess, I'm afraid, because so many people who are trafficked remain confined and live out their life there and die there and never escape. So sorry that I can't give you a figure, but definitely people who are caught up in disasters, some of those people will be trafficked, because traffickers are, trafficking is at organized crime level, highly organized and very good at finding vulnerable people who can be manipulated.
Yeah.
Is it true, Pippa, that there might be people who you find who are on the streets, who are being prosecuted? They've been trafficked and they've been prosecuted. They're put into jail.
Yeah.
And then once they're in jail, when they come out of jail, the traffickers are there to pick them up again. Is that?
So we have a very it was Theresa May she was at one time our Prime Minister, but while she was our Home Secretary, she introduced the hostile environment to immigration. That was an official policy, and from then on, it's been draconian for anybody trying to seek asylum in the UK. And most of our women who we work with who have escaped from traffickers, when they escape, they are not believed that they've been the victims of trafficking. The onus is on them to evidence it. And how can you evidence it? You don't flee from traffickers with evidence that you have been trafficked. You have a split moment to escape and run for your life. And so most of the women we work with come to us from prison, and it's because when they've escaped, they've then been prosecuted by immigration forces, and they're usually sentenced to a year in prison on immigration offences. And you're right, the traffickers, they are at the gate of prison. And they're very cunning, they're very artful. They'll offer a job. They'll say, oh, we've got a job in a wood making factory, do you need work? So yeah, they can be in a cycle of traffic, escape from traffickers, prison, trafficked again at the gate of prison. It's very, very difficult to get out of and to escape from in the UK. Very brutal.
There's a question here. The comment made about the Scandinavian countries being successful in mental health due to their social support services available and high taxation is interesting to me. I have spoken with a Danish woman in social services who mentioned that part of the reason that the country is so willing to pay to care for those in need is because they feel a kinship towards those struggling because it is such a homogeneous culture. How can we make a country as diverse as the US care for those struggling? Oh, this is for you, Karen.
Oh man, and I agree. One of the things that I was thinking about as we were having this conversation is how heterogeneous the United States is. And it makes it very difficult for us to translate what's happening in other countries that might be less heterogeneous to this context. And so, outside of our leadership, who, if the leadership looks more like the United States, and there's empathy, and there are lived experiences so that people who are in positions of power can empathize and relate to other people, then I think things would change. But as you probably know, to run for Congress, you have to almost be rich, right? Just the sheer amount of resources that are required to run for an elected position is extreme. And so you end up with entitled, influential, rich people who are in these positions of power. Now, with that said, we still need to work on that and figure out, how to change that system. I teach my students to focus on local issues. It's a little bit easier to address issues that are happening at the local level with your elected officials than looking at the federal government, because it seems like it's Goliath, right? And we are the David. And so oftentimes you feel more empowered when you're addressing issues at the local level. And I don't think that we want to homogenize, right, the heterogeneity of the United States. I do think that we need to have more respect for our differences, that we need to acknowledge that we all bring something to the table, but that's the whole idea of diversity, right? It's not just that you have different bodies that look different, it's that you're bringing different perspectives, that you're bringing different lived experiences, and that you respect them all, and that everyone has a voice, right? But until we reach that point, with the dismantling of DEI more recently in this country with these executive orders, it's going to be a challenge. But again, my parents went to segregated schools. My parents. My father served in a segregated army. My father, right? I am a professor.
Great.
Right? I grew up poor. And I went to public schools. And I am a professor. And so I think that we have the ability to be successful. We have the ability to be inclusive. We have the ability to have strong leaders who care. Right? It's just going to take time, but we have wonderful examples, not just me. There are so many people like me and who have a very, even more interesting story to tell. But I do think we can embrace the diversity of our country and also have empathy and respect for our differences and care about each other. And we just need to figure out, how do we make those connections, right? And I think we know how to do that. We just need the will to do it.
Thanks for that. Mario, I think you wanted to come in on some of that question.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, my father was a lion trainer, so I don't know quite whether that's fighting social services and health boards is actually coming in handy. But I do seriously, I think the whole question of diversity is absolutely crucial, and how you can actually bring together a country as complicated as whether it's UK, even more complicated and bigger in America, and obviously across the Western world, especially when you can look at these examples, and the example of Scandinavia is a good one, and it's based, isn't it, on kinship, sense of place, a respect for each other. It's as basic as that, really, and I think that's where you've got to start.
Thanks very much. Susan Wolfe has put in a question. Thanks, Susan, for this. I read today that diversity programs have been cancelled in the States. How are people coping with this? I'm American, living in London, UK. This is scary stuff. Karen.
It is scary stuff. And, but I want to assure you, Susan, that these efforts have been challenged for many, many years, regardless of what you call it. And so I think that the efforts will not change. They will not stop. We are very creative and innovative. And many of us do believe that we are better because we are diverse. And so if there is an executive order that changes a title or an office, what I understand from this morning, people who have these titles are going to be placed on paid leave. It doesn't change the battle. It doesn't change our will. It doesn't change our goal. And so I think that before there were DEI initiatives, we were still working at this, right? We didn't have DEI during, desegregation or Brown v. Board. If Brown v. the Board of Education, right? But they were diversity efforts. And so I think that it's up to us to change the nomenclature. I don't think we're going to change our efforts. I think we're going to be more creative about what we call things, but we're still going to continue. And so I don't want to minimize the fact that this is happening. The fact that this is happening, that, that a leader of a very diverse nation would use, his executive power to do this is quite troubling. But I also know that it doesn't change the commitment of people for diversity, equity, inclusion, because we know that it matters, and we know that it makes a difference, and it makes us better. And so I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that this will just put, fire under us to continue to move forward and to challenge what's happening at the federal level.
Thanks for that. That's very positive. Do you have a positive note to end with, Pippa?
I do. I mean, I think what I said earlier about the young people and how impressive they are and committed they are, and they haven't learned it from our generation who have messed it up for them. But I think I have a lot of hope. And as I said earlier, the women I work with, they have survived so much and still want to live. And nothing can be more positive than that, working with somebody who has suffered inconscionable losses and still has hope and still wants to live. So I take my example from the women I work with. I take my example from the young people who I try to surround myself with. And I think I agree with Karen. I think, if anything, it might strengthen the resolve, the recent initiatives against diversity in your country. So I am, on balance, I am optimistic. I think, it's important to recognise what the challenges are and not be naive. But I think people are good, essentially, and that is going to win out. And we are learning, and we do know what to do, as we've all said. And I think with time, we will do the right things. We'll find better ways to let good people lead us and get to the top, I am sure.
Mario, thanks for that, Pippa. Mario, what's your final say on this?
Well, my final say is, again, I'm going to repeat again what I said earlier about our national treasure. I think he's 99 years old, David Attenborough. He is ever optimistic, and I think talking to the people who we care for in our homes, older people with very rich lives, and some younger people also who are unwell, most unwell, some of them, and yet have this great desire to live and are interested in the world. I think that's the sort of optimism that we need to capture. And I hope that will see us through, but I hope that we have a much, a global sort of population that just is more content and is kinder to each other, kinder to the planet, and our well-being is better cared for.
I know you're a great supporter of Manchester United.
I was hoping you weren't going to mention that.
Well, they're not doing too badly now. They were, but I just wonder whether sport is another way through as well. People getting involved in sport and enjoying sport just for the sake of it.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
it's a great leveler. It's a great thing about you build relationships. Team sports are probably some of the most important activities to actually, develop your character, your personality. So I'd endorse that 100%, Mike.
Yeah. Even if it is Manchester United. Yeah.
Well, even so, or Wrexham.
Even so, right. As people might know, I support the Wolves rather than Manchester United, but they're doing even worse than Manchester United at the moment.
Yeah.
So I can't.
Well, can I just say that Wrexham have done ever so well and continue to do well since our Hollywood stars bought them and are running the club properly.
Absolutely terrific. Okay, Sandy, any words before I close us?
Well, talking about these very sad issues, sharp, profoundly sad, I think we've had a luxury today in a way, and we've had just such wonderful people with us today whose lives are models, in my view, for those who want to try to take the world view and improve things. So Mike, we didn't make a mistake trying to get away from politics today, even if we didn't succeed. We brought up something that we don't always feel we have the luxury to afford, and I'm glad we did it. So thank you for your partnership with me on this. It's always enlightening, always I think ultimately hopeful in so many ways. And thanks to all our panelists, to our supporting institutions at Oxford and at Georgetown University in Washington. We're going to keep going and keep finding topics. Next month, we'll be talking about the relationship between free speech and artificial intelligence, which I think we'd better learn and teach more about in the days ahead as well. So thanks to all, and let's try to remain hopeful. And thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you too, Sandy. Thanks to Pippa then, and to Mario and to Karen. An amazing conversation today. And I think we all benefited from the conversation itself. As you say, the next project in the Free Speech Project is Wednesday, February the 19th, when we will be talking about artificial intelligence and its impact on the world. The next Cultural Encounters, Books That Have Made a Difference, will be on Monday the 10th of February. And we have a very distinguished man from Egypt who's going to be talking to us on the Quran, and Brother Adrian is going to be talking to us on the Quran on Monday the 10th of February. How that book has a cultural encounter with other books, particularly with Christian books, no doubt. For today, my thanks to colleagues at Georgetown, to Tom Banchoff in particular, who's the Vice President of Global Affairs. At Blackfriars, thanks to John O'Connor, the Regent, Richard Finn, the Director of Las Casas Institute. and also to our prior, new prior, Dominic White, at Campion Hall, to Nick Austin, the Master of the Hall. Also, thanks to John McCabe, who does a great job for us, and he's working with us all the time at Georgetown. I'd like to thank those who've asked very good questions today, and thank all of you who've attended with us today. I'm Professor Mike Scott. I'm Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall in Oxford. You can follow me on Facebook as Michael Kerr Scott or on LinkedIn as Professor Michael Scott. Until next time, everybody, take care, keep safe. Goodbye.